In today's episode, we're going to explore the psychology found in the landmark but controversial film Fight Club. We're going to specifically look at the messy psychology and mental health hinted at in the film. We're going to look at the psychology behind cults and the cult of personality. And then we're going to wrap it up and look at Fight Club not so much through a psychological lens, but as social commentary and a cultural statement about America. I'm Jonathan Hetterly, a licensed professional counselor, and this is Psych Cinema. Psych Cinema is Shrink Tank's video series where I explore the psychology found in the films that I watch and love. Before we get started, do me a favor. Subscribe to our channel and click on that notification bell. That way, you won't miss out anytime we drop new content that explores the rich intersection of psychology and pop culture. Now, Fight Club is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, and we've had a number of fans request that I do a deep dive into the film and the mental health and psychology depicted in the film. I'm a big fan of the director, David Fincher, and I'm also a marginal fan of the original author of the book Fight Club, Chuck Palahniuk. Now, having said that, I find it fascinating how much people point to Fight Club as this provocative and deep film when it looks at the psychology found in it, because I don't tend to see the same thing. So let's dive right into the messy or murky psychology and mental health hinted at in the film. Now, because this is 20 years old, if you haven't seen Fight Club, there's no need to even do any type of spoiler. We're going to dissect this film. And first and foremost, I don't think this film does a very accurate depiction of mental health and psychology. If we think of all the topics that come up in the film, whether it be insomnia, DID, or dissociative identity disorder, what used to be known as multiple personality disorder, dissociative fugue, or even schizophrenia, there's a lot of murky and messiness behind it. Because of that, it'd be really easy to be critical of the film, but I actually am not that critical about its depiction of mental health, mental illness, or psychology, because I don't think that is really the point behind the film. I think Chuck Palahniuk and David Fincher use psychology sort of as a narrative device, and that gives them liberty to really use it in a way that they're not really depicting any one of those with great accuracy. We see this movie more as a social satire. It is a metaphor. There's a lot of hyperbole and exaggeration. If we think about insomnia, the character played by Ed Norton tells the film goers that he hasn't slept in 6 months. And we just know that that is impossible for someone to be alive if they haven't slept in 6 months. They certainly are not going to look as fit and functional as Edward Norton does in the film. So right there, we get the cue that this is an exaggeration of mental health and mental illness. In the same way, we look at DID, dissociative identity disorder, and we recognize that this film is not particularly accurate or thorough in its depiction. We know multiple personality, DID, generally comes from childhood trauma. And when we think about DID, dissociative identity disorder, this film doesn't really go that deep into it. And some of the other mental health that it sort of puts out there makes it very murky and messy. In fact, one could argue, what is it more accurate depicting? Dissociative identity disorder or schizophrenia? When we think of schizophrenia, we think of visual hallucinations, talking or any type of hallucination. Where we think about DID, it's a fractured self or personality or voice or alter that someone is aware of that at times feels like is taking control of a person's body and behaviors. When we think of DID, that usually comes from childhood trauma. There's no explanation for that here. In fact, it seems like Ed Norton's character only comes across Tyler Durden, the self or the alter played by Brad Pitt. He only comes across it after 6 months of insomnia, after going to the self-help groups in the middle of the night. So it doesn't seem like that's really been present for a long period of time. Whereas schizophrenia and visual hallucinations, we know, can really manifest itself at any particular time. And then finally, when we think about how at the end of the film, the Ed Norton character rids himself of Tyler Durden, is that he shoots himself, thereby destroying Tyler Durden and being back into his primary controlled self. And we know that's just not how DID works when you have a splintered personality or another self. It really, in therapy, it's really about reintegrating or fusing or merging those personalities or those people back together into one cohesive self. You can't just shoot yourself and that character or person will immediately go away. But again, I don't think that David Fincher or Chuck Palahniuk, that their purpose is to really depict mental illness in an accurate way. It's a device. They're too smart of people, to be quite honestly. So I think they throw a lot of it together to say something bigger, and that really is the second point when we think more about not the psychology of mental illness or DID, but the psychology of cults and the psychology of charismatic personality. Because when we think about Fight Club itself, the first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club.
Okay, the first rule of Jewish Fight Club is if somebody says ow, you stop.
Which really thematically highlights, I think, a more consistent and cohesive exploration in the film, which is the psychology of cults. When you look at how Tyler Durden, the character, creates this community of ardent followers, to where it's first you find people that have that feel disenfranchised, they feel marginalized, they feel victimized, and you play off of that disconnect, that anger, that contempt. And then through that you bridge conformity, you bridge control, compliance, and eventually obedience, to where the very interesting thing about cults, and then even with the Fight Club, is on the one hand, the central message is don't be a blind follower to anything, especially consumerism in this movie. But what do these people do? They eventually start blindly following Tyler Durden, and Fight Club morphs into this Project Mayhem, where it's really about inflicting all types of chaos and anarchy in the larger society. And why does that happen? Well, because Tyler Durden himself has a very charismatic type of personality that could easily rope in impressionable people. And in this film, you see how it starts out with a lot of impressionable people that are feeling very disconnected and unsatisfied in their life or in their job or even in the American dream and promise of what's been told to them at this point. Remember, this novel by Chuck Palahniuk was written and released around 1996, and then the film came out in 1999. And this was before 9/11. This really was before Columbine. This was before the Great Depression, the housing crash in the early 2000s. This was before a lot of school shootings or Al-Qaeda and all these other things. So we were coming out of a period of relative affluence and great economic potential. And in a lot of ways, you would think that it would be a time of great happiness and self-actualization. And this novel and this film spoke to a number of people that didn't feel that way. So when you think of a cult of personality, you find people that are unhappy or mad, you stoke them through anger in a lot of ways, and then eventually, instead of freedom, they become controlled and they're locked into blind obedience. For people that are wanting to find personal freedom, now what they're actually doing is they're taking away the freedom of other people through Project Mayhem and creating anarchy and, just anything goes in a greater society. And so I think Fight Club does a more accurate job of looking at how someone can be really impressionable or angry, and before you know it, find themselves feeling like they belong to something greater, even if that's at the expense of somebody else or comes in conflict with their own morals and values. And so that, I think, is the strongest point of Fight Club, not the psychological aspects of DID or insomnia or schizophrenia or anything along those lines. But at the end of the day, I think David Fincher and I think Chuck Palahniuk is laughing at a lot of the ardent supporters and defenders of Fight Club, the film and the book. Because I think it's written in such a dark, comedic way that the overall point of Fight Club is a big social satire and cultural commentary, and the fact that people find it so deep and meaningful, I think they probably laugh at, because as pure filmmaking, as pure writing, this is high quality content. But in terms of a movie with real deep message and takeaway or solutions, it's actually quite shallow and simplistic. Think about it. Think about what this is really saying about our culture. Number one, it's really highlighting the fragility of masculinity. In today's culture, we could talk about toxic masculinity, how men respond when they feel like they're victims, when they feel like the rules have changed and they no longer favor them. And instead of taking personal responsibility or showing adaptability, they basically say, the world is unfair. We've been sold a book of lies, and you know how we're going to deal with it? We're going to smash each other to smithereens, and then we're going to smash other people's stuff. You know, that is not a particularly profound message. If anything, that kind of reinforces how the fragility of masculinity, men do not know how to overall deal with adversity, setbacks, or when they feel like the odds are stacked against them. Hello, men. People of color and minorities and women, they've been experiencing that their entire life, feeling like society and culture is not really set up for them to succeed. Welcome to the club. But then you think about what's the overall message or solution? Anarchy, personal freedom. There's not a lot of depth here. I mean, what's the big takeaway message? Follow your dreams. Have courage, right? Don't find your purpose in things. Don't be such a blind slave to materialism and consumerism. Those are not particularly profound. And yet people look at Fight Club and they think that there's all this real deep, rich message behind it. And honestly, I think the creators of this are laughing. They're laughing at, wow, we are making a mockery of the American dream, and people are lapping it up because the film offers no depth of solution. It's basically saying, hey, look, you guys are pretty shallow, and you deal with it in a really elementary and simplistic way. And then the solution is really not a solution. Like if you want personal freedom or Project Mayhem, the actual message or purpose behind it was to rid the world of debt. Well, guess what? Blowing up things will not get rid of debt. Why? Because humans will continue to amass more debt. The problem is humans. It's not the infrastructure or society. And I think that actually goes back more to David Fincher and Chuck Palahniuk, both who I believe have a very bleak view of mankind. And so with this movie, they're basically saying, yeah, people suck. They don't know what to do when they have setbacks, and let's have fun at their expense. Because I wonder if a lot of people that love Fight Club are the very people that find like punching somebody or being punched a cathartic way of dealing with the hardships of life. But you tell me what you think about Fight Club. If you are a huge defender and supporter of this film, what am I missing? Where is this movie deep, and does it have a lot of themes and explorations that resonate with you that somehow I missed or dismissed and overlooked? Be sure to leave a comment below, and you're always welcome to recommend another film that you would like for me to tackle here on Psych Cinema. Be sure to follow me on Twitter. You can check out also shrinktank.com, where you're going to find other videos, articles, podcasts, and more that explore the rich content between psychology and pop culture. That's going to do it for today's episode. I'm Jonathan Hetterly. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again at the movies.